and Resiliency Program over at the Office of Planning and Research. There's lots of people registered for this webinar, but I'm just gonna dive right into it because we've got a lot to get through. My name is Nikki Caravelli. I'm an assistant planner with the Office of Planning and Research. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that we at OPR join you in our office from the Sacramento, California land on ancestral Nishanan tribal land. So we want to thank them for the stewardship of these lands for thousands of years. And our agenda moving forward through today, first, myself and my colleague Eric will provide an introduction to Phase 1, Equity, Community Engagement, and Plan Alignment. I please invite you to use the chat to communicate and share resources, but do please hold any questions for speakers that are related to the content until the breakout rooms. After our introductory remarks, we'll hear from some speakers, Natalie Hernandez from Climate Resolve and Allison Spindler-Ruiz from the City of Long Beach. And then we'll hopefully have about 40 minutes to break out where folks can ask speakers additional questions and discuss. Can folks still hear me? I'm seeing a notification that I'm muted. Can I just get a verbal confirmation from someone?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You are breaking up though.
Okay. Not sure what to do about that. Let me know if it keeps happening and then maybe I'll just turn off my video to see if that helps. Okay, moving right along. Just to recap, this is our schedule for this spring series. We're in the second webinar. So now to dive into the workshop content, I am going to start us off with a Zoom poll. I'd love to just know where you're coming from. So please enter the question as it pops up. I'll give about 15 seconds for folks to answer that. All right, looks like we have a lot of folks from local or regional government, state and federal government, nonprofits and businesses, most folks from local or regional government. Nice to see you all here today. Thanks for hopping on. I have a second question for you. How comfortable are you coordinating community engagement in the context of climate adaptation planning? Looks like most folks fall in the a little comfortable range, which is totally fine. That's why we're hosting this webinar. We know it's an area of interest for many folks. And my last question for you, if you are involved in adaptation planning in your community, which adaptation planning phase are you in? And these phases are again from the Adaptation Planning Guide if you're just joining us. Looks like a pretty even spread across phase 1, 2, and 3. Quite a few folks haven't started yet. That's totally fine. That's what phase 1 is. Hopefully will be helpful for you to understand. All right, thanks for indulging our curiosity, helping us understand who's in the room here. Okay, so diving right in, what is phase 1 all about? So phase 1 is about exploring, defining, and initiating, making sure you know what you're getting into before you get into it. And there are 4 steps, excuse me, in this initial phase. The first step, motivation and scope, is about confirming why communities are undertaking adaptation planning efforts, what they hope to get out of it, and what are the broad parameters of effort. The second step, teams and resources, is about ensuring that the right people are involved and that the participants have the resources they need. The third step is choosing the climate effects and populations and assets to be analyzed in your adaptation plan, helping to set up the more technical analyses to follow. And outreach and engagement is a critical component and should be ongoing throughout this phase and through all subsequent phases. The first phase is all about making sure that communities' adaptation planning efforts have a clear foundation, goals, work group, and other aspects of a framework before the in-depth work begins. And we found that a scoping phase like this helps to ensure that the effort is comprehensive and holistic from the beginning, and that it's conducted efficiently and on time. It also provides, in our guidance, we provide resources for integrating actions with local hazard mitigation plans and other planning processes. And we'll dig a little bit more into plan alignment later. I'm seeing my chat window pop up, so if there's anything critical that I should address, just wave me down. These are some of the key questions that we hope phase 1 will help communities answer. I'm not going to read them aloud right now, but we wanted to make sure that planners and whoever's involved are thinking about some of the big vision related aspects of adaptation planning, as well as some of the logistics of the process, such as budget and who should be involved. Phase 1 outreach and engagement involves creating an equitable outreach and engagement plan. And this plan can include a core project team with a mix of representatives from various government departments, community-based organizations, public institutions, hospitals, colleges, utility companies, and major employers and other groups. This phase also provides recommendations for establishing and using public-private partnerships and stakeholder mapping to ensure an equitable outreach process. One important aspect to consider here is the public participation spectrum and whether the process will inform, consult, involve, collaborate, or empower the community. This step can help identify persons and frontline communities who might be most vulnerable to climate change and ensures that planning processes, distribution of resources, and efforts to address systemic wrongs are conducted in an equitable manner. To recap, the Adaptation Planning Guide recommends integrating community outreach and engagement into all phases of the adaptation planning process. This will build trust between the core planning team and community stakeholders and develop a plan that has collective support. Outreach and engagement should be considered carefully and budgeted appropriately. The approach should include stakeholders within the organization or agency leading the adaptation planning process and those external to the organization or agency. So now I'm going to invite you to participate in another more interactive poll. So if you have the ability, please pull out your phone or another browser on your computer and go to menti.com, menti.com, and then use the code on the screen, and I'll repeat the code in a second. Thanks, Natalie. So the code, once you're on menti.com, is 4433415. Go ahead and just type the first phrase or association or whatever equity might mean to you. And we should hopefully begin seeing that soon here on the screen. It does take a few seconds for the internet to catch up, so. And just so everyone's aware, this webinar is recorded actually, and we will be sharing the recording and the slides with everyone. So I think for whatever reason, the internet's just not reflecting people's results. So in the interest of time, I'll just move on, but I'll be sure to capture the results and keep them in the slides afterwards. So the definition that we have in the Adaptation Planning Guide is that all people are justly and fairly included in society and that everyone is able to participate, prosper, and achieve their full potential. It recognizes that everyone enjoys different advantages and faces different challenges, and that everyone should be treated justly and fairly according to their circumstances. So equity should be treated as a critical component of all planning, including climate adaptation planning. And this involves identifying persons who might be most vulnerable to climate change and ensuring that planning processes, distribution of resources, and efforts to address systemic wrongs are conducted in an equitable manner. So what then is a vulnerable community? Early on, when our program, the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, was launched, our Technical Advisory Council recognized that there was a lot of work to do to better understand the factors that drive vulnerability to climate risk and made it a priority to define vulnerability, its key factors, and to provide a guidebook for defining vulnerable communities. The key components to understanding this definition are risk, sensitivity, and capacity. And all three of these are critical to truly understanding climate vulnerability. I'm not going to read this definition, but know that you can access it in our Vulnerable Communities Guidebook, which was made to make this definition actionable. ICARP and our council developed this guide, which also includes a summary of some of the statewide assessment tools, though not all of them, to use it to identify vulnerable communities in a climate adaptation context. So this guide includes a crosswalk with the indicators that are required elements of an SB 1000 analysis, which Eric will dive into a little bit more later, additional indicators that could be used to assess underlying vulnerability on a case-by-case basis, and a list of process guides that can serve to aid agencies undertaking efforts to define vulnerable communities. There are many additional resources in the Adaptation Planning Guide that are helpful for understanding the root causes and factors affecting these key aspects, so I encourage you to check them out. This diagram is just one example. And so finally, if there are not existing government-to-government relationships in your community with tribes, addressing climate impacts may be the perfect opportunity to build and strengthen partnerships. Given the state's long history of violence and disenfranchisement towards tribes, finding ways to work together to move forward in an equitable way and continuing to repair this broken history must and should be a primary consideration in any adaptation process. State law also does require local agencies to consult California Native American tribes to aid in the protection of traditional tribal cultural places through local planning processes, and local agencies should consider following our tribal consultation guidelines for any climate adaptation related update to the general plan or other planning documents as early as possible in the planning phase. All the guidance in the Adaptation Planning Guide is also written to support tribal governments as well, and a number of resources in the guide are specifically directed towards tribes, such as the Adaptation Planning Toolkit, which is a collection of templates and other resources developed by the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. So I'm not going to go over these resources, but these are all available in the Adaptation Clearinghouse at resilientca.org that may be helpful for addressing and understanding equity and community engagement. I am going to highlight a couple specific resources on our Phase 1 interactive page on the Clearinghouse. On the very first page, you can actually download a couple of different templates, such as a stakeholder mapping template and budget template. So be sure to check those out. And now I am going to turn it over to Eric to talk us through our introduce SB 379 and plan alignment. And Eric is the project manager for our community development and planning department over at OPR.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to quickly just dive into some regulatory and kind of policy context setting things as we're talking about phase one and the adaptation planning guide and setting the table for an adaptation planning process. We wanted to make sure that everyone is aware. I know many of you are, but just to quickly go over kind of the legal requirements. Many of them are relatively new for addressing climate adaptation in the planning framework we have in California. So SB 379 passed in 2015 does require that the safety element of the general plan must be updated to address it. I got a window popping on and off. Lost my presentation there for a minute. That does require that the safety element address climate vulnerability and adaptation. And of course, there are very specific timing and triggering provisions in the law. If you do have a local hazard mitigation plan in your community and you are going through a 5-year update, anytime after January 1 of 2017, you should now be in the process of updating your safety element. And of course, if you don't have a local hazard mitigation plan, your deadline for doing so is January 1 of 2022. So we're sort of in this window of time periods where most local agencies should be already having done this or be in the scoping phase of the work based on when you did a local hazard mitigation plan update. Those plans, of course, by federal law, have to be updated every 5 years. The law does provide a lot of flexibility. It is okay to address climate adaptation throughout your general plan, as long as your safety element at a minimum includes some of those policies. You could address those in other parts of your general plan as well. It's also okay, according to the statute, to incorporate a separate standalone climate adaptation plan by reference into your safety element. The one key requirement, of course, as with all plans that are incorporated by reference into any general plan element, is that it must meet the minimum statutory requirements in that separate incorporated plan. SB 1035 also does require an 8-year interval of reviewing and updating your flood, fire hazards and your climate adaptation portions of your safety element. That was passed into law a few years ago. So now it's one thing to have an adaptation plan, but now we're asking folks to make sure those plans are updated and reviewed every 8 years around the same time that your housing element is updated. So that sort of sets in place an institutional mechanism for making sure that our plans are up to date and updated periodically. Next slide, please. And we're not going to go in the weeds on all the statutory requirements today, but just know that we've outlined a process in our general plan guidelines. And of course, it is somewhat aligned. It's aligned fairly well with what's stated in the adaptation planning guide in terms of, first reviewing your existing plans, trying to figure out how you addressed hazards before, what the scope of updates might be needed to address climate change in light of the hazards that you have. Definitely completing that climate change vulnerability assessment is a legal requirement in the statute. And of course, the statute has very specific provisions that you must meet. And of course, the adaptation planning guide in various sections does go through a much more detailed and comprehensive process of how not just to meet the legal requirements, but how to do so in a way that integrates community engagement and a lot of other really important technical guidance that's just not stated in the law. You also must have climate adaptation and resilience goals, policies, and objectives, and of course, feasible implementations to make all those goals and objectives effectuated on the ground. And of course, the finalization and adoption process as well. We do encourage everyone to read the statute for yourself, as well as our general plan guidelines, to know what's required and what OPR specific guidance is on the minimum requirements. And of course, use the adaptation planning guide to sort of supplement what the law and our guidance does say. Next slide, please. We did want to quickly touch on the relationship of two relatively new statutory requirements that were passed pretty close together at the same time. SB 1000, of course, did add a requirement to address environmental justice in that same general plan. And so, of course, if you are adopting two or more elements concurrently and your agency does contain disadvantaged communities as defined in the statute, you must adopt an EJ element or an equivalent EJ element throughout the general plan. At the time that the law says you must do so. We did want to highlight that while SB 1000 doesn't specifically call out climate change or the impacts of climate change, it doesn't take a lot of thinking to realize that the unique or compounded health risk can include the effects of climate change, and that climate change is already exacerbating and in the future will continue to exacerbate the disproportionate environmental and kind of adverse health burdens that are experienced in disadvantaged communities. And we often see a lot of overlap between the issues being experienced and impacted under-resourced and disadvantaged communities and how we frame vulnerable communities in the context of climate adaptation. So, Nikki had that slide earlier in our presentation that highlighted some of the indicators or ways that you can align who you might define as disadvantaged for SB 1000 purposes with some of the needs around vulnerable communities and climate adaptation analysis. So I want to make sure we highlight that opportunity. We do see a big opportunity here to advance climate equity by coordinating environmental justice element preparation with the work that you're doing to meet your SB 379 requirements. And of course, we do have very specific guidance I've highlighted on the screen here about how not just to look at environmental justice, but also think about a bigger framework about promoting equitable and resilient communities and healthy communities and how to tie these issues together. Next slide, please. For the sake of time, I know I'm running a bit over, so I'm just going to say that we do strongly encourage plan alignment and integration. One of our breakout sessions today will go into a lot more detail on this, but of course, there's a huge opportunity, a number of incentives that are available to look at integrating other plans into your general plan, as well as how to connect planning efforts together. A lot of our plans serve different purposes and they meet different needs and have different requirements. But a huge opportunity, of course, to integrate local hazard mitigation planning in with general planning and adaptation planning, very issue-specific topics like the community wildfire protection plan mechanisms, the flood protection plan. A lot of different plans can help you align with the work that you need to do through climate adaptation. So we strongly encourage that. Our guidance does mention that, and we'll go into the more specific discussions today in some of the breakout rooms. I think back to you now, Nikki.
Thanks so much, Eric. And I know that there's so much that we could cover related to equity and community engagement and plan alignment and integration and everything. So hopefully the breakouts will help you help us to answer some of our questions and discuss some of these details. Just a couple resources on the clearinghouse that are helpful for plan alignment specifically. We have a whole topic page area dedicated to it, as well as a plan alignment compass for coastal areas. And then we also have a new memo that we just put up on the clearinghouse. So now I'm going to move us to the next part of our agenda. I'm excited to invite to the stage Natalie Hernandez, our Associate Director for Climate Planning and Resilience at Climate Resolve, who will talk us through some of her experiences, tips, and tricks for community engagement and equity.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm going to share my screen. Nikki, can you remind me how many minutes I have?
About 15.
15, okay. Let me put this in here and share my screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Natalie Hernandez. I'm the Associate Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at Climate Resolve, and I'm calling in today from my home in Long Beach, which is on historic Tongva and Indigenous land. And I put a link into the chat if you wanted to introduce yourself and also look at the historic land that you're calling from. So if you don't know about Climate Resolve, we're a small organization that's based in Southern California, and we focus on a number of different issues, but our overall motto is that we know that climate change is a global issue, but there are a lot of things that we could do to have local solutions. At our heart, we're an advocacy organization, and we push for climate legislation at the state and local levels, like advocating for funding to help people walk, bike, or take public transit in their neighborhoods. And we also work on community projects and planning efforts, like working with city government and residents to install roofing and surface designs that help cool down the neighborhood, as well as helping residents prepare for and respond to wildfires. And so I'm here to talk today about the Adaptation Planning Guide in Phase 1. I'm putting together the core project team, as well as other things that will help local governments prepare for putting together an adaptation plan. And usually the folks that are involved in the core project team are the entities that oversee the safety element or a standalone climate action or adaptation plan, and then the local hazard mitigation plan. And so usually this includes local government departments such as planning and development, public works, and public health. But these are not just limited to these departments. I'm just putting this out here as an initial list and starting point. I think what's really important, more so than who's on the team, is the equity within the team makeup. So that we have a lot of languages, for example, in the state of California. So if you can recruit multilingual staff, I think that helps make engagement and outreach approaches a lot more robust, as well as making sure that they're a little bit more culturally relevant to the populations that you're reaching. The other thing is to look at the team makeup and see if it's reflective of the community with racial and ethnic demographics, diverse perspectives and lived experiences like renters or parents or different age ranges. And then moreover, having potentially a staff training on cultural humility and racism and systems of injustice. There are a lot of issues related to climate vulnerability that are impacted by past history, such as redlining and bad land use practices. And I think it's important in all of us to recognize that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are most affected by climate change. So it's really important to hire staff that understand some of those power dynamics when working with populations. And some of this stuff maybe seems it's very simple, but you'd be surprised how many times I think this stuff isn't looked at. The equity within the team makeup or staff training when folks are putting out RFPs or proposals to respond to a climate adaptation planning effort. So that brings in consultants, right? I know most of the folks here on this call are from local governments, but may work with consultants, and there are consultants on this team. So I think consultants are really good to help coordinate a planning effort or provide expertise, especially for local governments that don't have that capacity. But I ask you in the audience to look for the equity in the team makeup that you all are, or if you're coordinating a planning effort or starting that. And also ask explicitly for equity approaches in the consultants that you hire, and look for that type of language in the approach to the RFPs. And then also look to make advisory groups. So a lot of times, the core project team is kind of small. But I think putting together an advisory group that's of diverse representation of youth, maybe hospitals, schools, business, utilities, tribal and native representatives is really important and can help make your adaptation planning effort much more robust. And there is always a need to provide stipends for those who might need compensation to participate. Then there's partnerships. Partnerships are a little bit more formal than the community advisory groups themselves. And I think they could be really helpful to implement some of the I guess you could say, initiatives needed to put together the plan. Community-based organizations and Native-led organizations, we've worked with, I have experience having contracted them directly to do outreach to various populations and also bring local expertise and history to the projects and stories that help make the plan itself very real. Universities and colleges have helped me in the past with local research and data that's maybe not so readily available through some of the public websites, but can do their own data. And then artists, I think having a plan that in the end is very visual and user-friendly is something that artists can bring in the process. And then having business and economic perspectives and funding and having that really established through a partnership, I think will, again, make the plan very good in the end. And something that I like to do with stakeholder engagement is to map it out. So I don't want to overwhelm anyone in this presentation. And I think sometimes the word even stakeholder engagement gets people a little bit scared. And I think that's because it's like, where do we start? And this map here, this is taken from the Adaptation Planning Guide template, but there's a way to look at the different groups that you might engage and where you might actually put some more effort into engaging them. And so I think this really helps set expectation between the city, the local government, and possibly the consultant team in figuring out which, again, groups that you might spend more time on or even put on an advisory committee. So in the top right-hand corner, there's those high influence, high interest people that you manage closely and engage deeply. And so I put in there a youth commissioners, public health department, Native American commissioners, and public works commissioners. And this map here is kind of what I've been doing most recently for the LA County Climate Vulnerability Plan, or kind of mimics some of the groups that we thought about engaging in that process. And within stakeholder mapping, it's also good to include hard-to-reach climate vulnerable populations, people experiencing homelessness, those with disabilities, those linguistically isolated, undocumented, maybe folks who don't have access to broadband internet, and then rural communities. And budget, I know this varies across communities. Some local governments are really small, some maybe rural communities maybe might struggle with this more than big urban cities. And I've just said, that's okay. Some people are going to have $100,000, some people are going to have $300,000. But to give community engagement an equitable ratio in the budget. So on the contracts that we've worked on as Climate Resolve, it's usually like a third of the budget, and that allows us to do workshops, listening sessions, surveys, things that are really going to make the plan more implementable. And again, it is nice to contract community-based organizations for outreach, but sometimes those processes are a little complicated because they're not approved beforehand to participate in the RFP process. So one way to do that is to work through the consultants already to then directly contract with the community-based organizations. And for both virtual engagement and in person, with COVID, I think a lot of things have shifted, but we found that both work, and we've been able to still have robust community engagement in all of it. And these are some tools that Climate Resolve uses to have virtual engagement. One is the Google Jamboards, which is free. It's kind of like this Post-it sticky note board. And then Mentimeter, you all just participated in that. And it's a way to do live polling. There's a word cloud right here on the side. And then Remo is a platform, you have to pay for it, but it's a way to do networking and kind of have like an open house style workshop. And then for in-person engagement in the past, Climate Resolve has done a pop-up outreach, or we've been at farmers markets and street events. We've also talked to people and surveyed them as they're maybe walking to and from a transit station, and then have done door-to-door canvassing to local businesses. And I just want to note that the APG Phase 1 does have a bunch of equitable engagement resources, so you don't have to necessarily start from zero, and I would encourage you to check those out. And then reach out to me. Climate Resolve is always looking for new projects to work on, and I'll put this information also in the chat if you wanted to reach out and let us know. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie. Such a great wealth of information. I'm sure folks have tons of questions for you, but they're going to have to hold it for the breakouts. So now I'm going to turn it over to our final speaker for the speaking portion of our webinar today, Allison Spindler-Ruiz, Planner and Budget Specialist at the City of Long Beach.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be with you this morning from native Tongva land here at the City of Long Beach. Again, my name is Allison. I'm going to just pull up my screen. I'm happy to be able to talk to you today about our work to center communities most impacted by climate change in the City of Long Beach. So I know we have folks from all over the state. So if you're not familiar with Long Beach, we're a city about 500,000 residents, very diverse, ranked on several things as a very bikeable and walkable city, a coastal city, which we'll get to in a moment. But as we learned through a vulnerability assessment, or as our community has known for a long time, we're a very diverse city, but also a very segregated one. I'm sure you're all familiar with Cal and Bioscreen. You can see here on the map, you can go 2.2 miles in Long Beach and go from the 99th percentile in Cal and Bioscreen, so worse off than 99% of census tracts, to the top 10 to 15% in green, just a couple miles away. So that's our existing environmental justice issues here in the city. And as we began to look at climate change impacts, you can see extreme heat vulnerability, social vulnerability layered on top of that, and the maps almost match exactly. Layer on top of that the percentage of white residents in the city, which is an almost exact inverse of the map on the bottom left, as well as where the children in our city live, which are disproportionately in those low-income communities of color that are most impacted by environmental justice and climate change issues. And I bring that up because when the city was, starting our climate change planning process, I think it was a very sort of traditional, forward-looking, how do we prepare for the future impacts of climate change? But you really cannot have a conversation about that without talking about the past and present injustices that are leading to the disparities we see in our community today. So that also leads to inequitable health outcomes. You can go about 7 miles in our city and see a 17-year difference in life expectancy. So with all that in mind, as we began the process of looking at our vulnerabilities across several climate factors in Long Beach, one that rose to the top of most conversations was sea level rise, and for good reason. You can see here by the year 2030, we expect pretty significant flooding. The dark blue is king tide flooding, and the light blue is projections for a 1% storm, a 100-year storm. And then here in 2050, you can see, if you're familiar at all with Long Beach, a big proportion of our Belmont Shore and Naples community experiencing at least intermittent flooding. It's about 10 million square feet of residential property, as well as a vast amount of commercial property. 2 fire stations, 3 schools, and a library. In addition to several other community assets. You can see some photos on the right of the parts of our community that are expected to experience flooding are sort of our more well-off parts of the city. So when we began to go out to talk to people about some of these climate change issues, I always tried to start the conversation with extreme heat, because we know extreme heat, as you saw in those first slides, has the greatest threat to life and public health in the city, has vulnerable populations, including children and older adults, can lead to heat-related illness, injury, and death, and is expected to get much worse in the next decades. But one thing I wanted to share, even when I was out talking to folks in Central, West, and North Long Beach, they always came back to these flood maps. And I think as planners, we love maps. Maps are fun to look at, and flooding, I think, is easier to picture. And it wasn't until we started talking about recent experiences in the city itself, such as a multi-day power outage we had in 2015, where people were making the connection between climate change and impacts today in the city. So during 2015, we had a power outage during a heat wave where people were out of power for several days. We had seniors living in high rises with no ability to get up and down the elevator without power, no ability to keep their food or medication refrigerated, really serious impacts, as well as you can see some of the flooding impacts from recent storms where people are kayaking down the street, or our fire rescuers are there getting folks, a wheelchair-bound resident out of his car. And framing from this perspective became much more powerful and got a lot more people to the table than those maps that I showed you at the beginning. So I wanted to share that. Now, when the power outage happened at the time, it wasn't a conversation about climate change. It was only looking back that we realized this, and that was in part due to a partnership with someone in our scientific community who made this graph for us and said, look at the extreme heat days the last decade that have gone way up. This is not just a future problem; it's a present problem. And if you look at the year 2015, it was our worst year on record for the number of heat days that lined up with that power outage. Another piece in terms of framing communications that's been so critical to our work and to how to build partnerships is to what Natalie said about ensuring inclusion and recognition of the historical planning context, which has brought us to these spatial disparities and socioeconomic disparities today. So this is an excerpt from our plan that calls out the way in which racial and economic disparities have created the environmental injustices in our city today that still exist and need to be addressed through our work. Another strategy that was important for us was to create a scientific working group where we had independent scientific experts who could weigh in on what data and information we should be using in our work. I should have mentioned we did both a climate action and adaptation plan, so we're looking at both mitigation and adaptation. Having local scientific experts helped us find information that our consultants had not found in their vulnerability assessment work with us, as well as our climate stressors review. And it also helped us tap into networks of people really interested in these issues, students and community groups who are connected with local researchers and professors. So from about mid-2018 to 2020, we reached about 10,000 Long Beach residents through about 50 events related to our CAP, large and small. And our process was really an iterative one. It started with our vulnerability assessment and recognizing communities most impacted. And then we did come up with preliminary engagement strategies. And then we did an internal and external equity assessment, bringing together other departments like our health department and our park staff to look at how we should develop and refine our engagement strategies, as well as a community working group we brought together of community-based organization leaders to help us develop tactics and strategies for how the outreach could look and the ways to best reach people and honor people in the process. Coming up with communication strategies and starting with meeting people where they are. So going to places where the community was already gathering, building relationships, and then going to try different things and co-learn with the community while creating deeper events that I'll show you in a minute, and being willing to iterate and try different things. One example, in working with our Latino community in Long Beach, we started by, again, going to events and festivals hosted by community organizations, just meeting people where they were, having a table, doing giveaways like air filters and emergency readiness packs, getting the information out, getting people's quick feedback, and then developing partnerships, for example, with an organization called Latinos in Action, who hosted us for a membership meeting where we created a Loiteria game around climate change and looked at precedents of how to address climate change through adaptation in Latin America in particular, and found that to be a really powerful way to have a deeper conversation. Long Beach also has the largest Cambodian population outside Cambodia, working with our Cambodian American population in the city, again, starting with meeting people where they were, having conversations with community organizations, participating in their business assistance workshops, and then leveraging a staff member that we have at the city who is Cambodian, speaks Khmer, and would often represent us at these events. Learning to do things like ground truthing our translation. I'm sure many of you have experienced this, where just because something is translated doesn't mean that it's well communicated or received. So that was an important lesson. And in particular, you can see this flyer on the right. We were told to translate the titles, but not the body of the flyer, because first generation Cambodian Americans tend to only speak Khmer, whereas second generation may only be able to read English. And so this was a suggestion we never would have thought of without centering the community in this conversation. Of course, climate change is something our youth will continue to inherit, so it was critical to us to center young people in the process by working with student groups, student organizations. We were part of the school district science fair, and the winning science fair projects were displayed at some of our CAP events, participated in youth leadership and youth organizing initiatives throughout the city. I also want to just note about how communication matters. On the left is just example of, our sort of typical city flyers or notices that go out. Pretty boring. I don't know how many people open them or read them. And on the right is a postcard we sent to all 7,000 homes in our Sea Level Rise 2050 area with color that said, "You're in our Sea Level Rise vulnerability area. Come talk to us about what that could mean." Here's a link to the information. As you can imagine, a lot of people showed up to that discussion. Here are some photos from that, where we had about 400 people show up to hear from Dr. Schubel from the aquarium about sea level rise and the long-term need for retreat, as well as a local architect who talked about what we can do in terms of adaptation in the short term. It happened to be at a location right next to the ocean, and it was raining really badly and the parking lot flooded, so there was sort of an interesting multifaceted part to the event. These topics can get really heavy, and so it's also to us very important to bring in art and creativity and ways to have the community share with us their solutions and what they're already doing on these issues. So we found it helpful to always have some sort of creative activity as part of our work. What sustainability means to me, what am I doing around climate change? And at our Climate Fest in 2019, you can see we hosted it in the top right map here at a public parking lot that's anticipated to be flooded by sea level rise. And we hired a local chalk artist who mocked up where those flooding impacts are going to be. You can see that in the middle right. And so during the event, everyone could participate in the collaborative art project to fill in the waves of where the parking lot's anticipated to be underwater. And then in the middle bottom here, the Beat the Heat sign that you see here was actually created by an art student at the Art Center for Design in Pasadena who participated with us. We had a group of students looking at how to communicate around climate change in Long Beach. So I know we're mostly here talking about engagement, but I just want to emphasize the importance of honoring or reflecting community input. We always made sure to record and share back what the community shared with us at events, posting it on our website and in our draft plans, and communicating how feedback is used in every step of the process. A couple examples include community asked time and again for us to look more at the greenhouse gas impacts of oil drilling, which isn't part of a typical community-wide GHG inventory, but is a huge issue, of course, in Long Beach. And so we did end up doing a supplemental analysis on that, which is now included in the plan. Put in that environmental justice section I showed you a piece of in the introduction, specifically calling out affordable housing and transportation actions, as well as doing an equity analysis of every action in our plan. Here's just one example of what that looks like. Again, we have like an equity strategy in every aspect of the plan to show not only what we're going to do with the plan, but how we should do it to best benefit communities most impacted. And as I wrap up here, some things that we've learned that we're trying to institutionalize include many of the things Natalie mentioned. Staff to better reflect our communities and who are unafraid to have some of these important conversations. I was not part of the city team yet when we did the RFP for the CAP back in 2015. I wasn't thrilled with how our outreach was set up at the time. And so we ended up doing a lot of it in-house and with budget that we could find kind of here and there. But when we went to develop our next grant for our U-Plan work up in North Long Beach, we did develop it so that we hired a set of sub-consultants who are community-based organizations being paid for their work to do capacity building and community engagement with the community towards more of this structural and systemic change we're talking about. So with that, thank you so much.
I just wanted to say, as a resident of Long Beach, like it was a really great process, Allison, and I do appreciate the work that you all did.
Thanks, Natalie. It's great to have you there.
Thanks so much, Allison. Really great work to see. Great case study, an example of equitable community engagement. So I was able to figure out, with some help, how to show the Menti results on my screen. So I am going to do that now. I just want to show you all what you all created. So this is great. I don't have much commentary here. Just let it all sink in for a second. Justice, fairness, opportunity, leveling the playing field, inclusion, access. All of these are great critical components to equity. So I'm going to move right along and get us to our breakouts. Thank you so much, Allison, Eric, and Natalie for introducing some really great and important tips and tricks and guidance on how to do this. Let me figure out how do I move to the next slide here. Okay, so our breakout sessions are a choose your own adventure, and we have 4 to choose from. We'll have 2 focused on plan alignment, one with Eric and Michael Germerad, who is a resilience planner from the Association of Bay Area Governments. Eric and Michael will be discussing wildfire, housing elements, safety elements, and how we can align all of these. And then in the second plan alignment breakout, we'll have Victoria